For decades, whispers surrounded King Charles, but at 75, he finally confirmed what many feared was true. And it changes everything. The day the admission came, it didn't feel real. The room was quiet and eerily so. And those present were stunned, not by what was said, but by who said it. For years, Charles had been the man behind the curtain, carefully maneuvering through tradition, duty, and silence. But now he had finally stepped into the light, not as the distant monarch, but as a man prepared to expose the weight he had carried for decades. In a voice both firm and fragile, he confirmed the suspicions that had long simmered beneath the surface of his reign. He had never felt worthy of the crown, not because he lacked the title or the lineage, but because, for the longest time, he believed he wasn't the son his father wanted, nor the leader his people expected. That single confession sent shockwaves through the monarchy, not because it was scandalous, but because it was real. There were no rehearsed lines, no polished royal spin. Just the truth. For the first time, the world saw a king stripped of his armor, bearing wounds he had hidden beneath a regal smile for decades. The room didn't erupt, it froze. Stunned courtiers stood motionless, as if the centuries of tradition they clung to had suddenly cracked beneath their feet. Princess Anne, stoic as ever, gave a silent nod, her gaze heavy with both sadness and understanding. Prince William's expression hardened, not out of anger, but from the collision of everything he thought he knew with what he had just heard. This wasn't a slip. This was deliberate, calculated, and yet deeply human. For the monarch who had been accused of being too cold, too soft, too indecisive, this moment was none of those things. It was, in every sense, a reckoning, but it hadn't come out of nowhere. This moment was the culmination of years of silent endurance. Behind every public appearance, every royal wave, every carefully composed photograph, there had been a man wrestling with legacy and self-doubt. The confession wasn't about guilt, it was about reclaiming a narrative that had always been controlled by others, by tabloids, by critics, by tradition. And now, with age closing in and the crown heavier than ever, Charles decided it was time. Time to lift the veil. Time to stop pretending. He didn't break down, he didn't apologize. What he did was far more terrifying for the monarchy, and for himself. He told the truth. And in doing so, he challenged every polished illusion that had protected the royal brand for generations. No more myths of perfect heirs and infallible kings. No more pretending the crown erases the past, because behind the polished gold and crimson robes was a boy who had spent his life believing he had failed before he even began. But to truly understand the weight of his admission, we must go back to the beginning, when the boy who would be king was already seen as a failure. He was born into power, but branded too fragile to wield it. Even his father questioned his worth. Before the crown ever touched his head, the whispers had already started. Prince Charles, the firstborn son of a reigning queen, was expected to embody strength, resolve, and an iron will shaped for monarchy. But instead, what emerged was something the royal establishment had no blueprint for: a boy who led with his heart rather than his fists. From the earliest days, Charles gravitated toward music, painting, and poetry. While other royal heirs were groomed in the art of stoicism, he cried during performances, sketched alone in palace corridors, and asked questions not of war, but of meaning. The institution saw creativity, but interpreted it as weakness. His tutors described him as thoughtful. His nannies whispered delicate. But to the royal machine, built on centuries of control and tradition, this tenderness wasn't endearing, it was dangerous. Prince Philip, hardened by war and legacy, watched his son's soft demeanor with a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. He had commanded fleets, survived battlefields, and stared down death. To him, power was grit, pain was necessary, emotion was a liability. And so, watching Charles scribble verses instead of shouting commands filled Philip with a quiet dread. This was not the man to one day lead an empire. He didn't say it outright. He didn't need to. Every instruction, every comparison, every icy glance was a lesson in what Charles was not. The tension between father and son deepened as Charles grew. Not because he misbehaved, but because he didn't conform. Where Philip expected a soldier, he got a soul. And for a royal father determined to forge a king, that was unacceptable. Queen Elizabeth, ever the sovereign, stood at a complicated crossroads. As a mother, she recognized Charles's sensitivity, even admired it in private. But, as the monarch, she was tethered to duty. The throne demanded a future ruler who could bear the weight of the Commonwealth, not a boy who clutched a paintbrush with trembling fingers. She tried to shield him behind palace walls. She softened Philip's harsher judgments, gave Charles quiet spaces to retreat into books and reflection. But she never intervened enough to change the course, because for Elizabeth, tradition didn't bend. It broke those who couldn't carry it. The royal family began speaking in urgent tones about the future. Courtiers, cousins, and senior aides expressed concern over the boy's lack of stamina and firmness. Around polished mahogany tables, conversations unfolded, not about Charles's happiness, but about his toughening. The word echoed through the corridors of Buckingham Palace like a warning bell. They weren't preparing him for adulthood, they were preparing him for war, but it was a war of image, perception, and expectation. They feared the public wouldn't respect a monarch who felt too much, who wept behind closed doors, who didn't relish the spotlight but recoiled from it. And so, a plan was drawn, one that would rip him from comfort and cast him into the very fire they believed would forge a king. And so, they sent him away far from the palace walls and into the arms of a world that showed no mercy. They called it education. For Charles, it was exile, and it nearly broke him. Gordonstown was never meant to be a school, not for someone like Charles. It was a crucible, brutal, unrelenting, and designed to crush softness out of boys until only discipline remained. But in the wind-swept Scottish Highlands, it was a place where warmth was a luxury, comfort was considered weakness, and every morning began with a test of survival. The royal family didn't send him there for academics. They sent him there to erase the boy he was and forge the man they needed. It was their answer to his tenderness, a solution built on suffering. And from the moment Charles arrived, it was clear he was not welcome, not even as a prince. There were no special privileges, no protective circles. Charles stepped onto the campus not as a future king, but as a rich boy among wolves. The staff, hand-picked for their ironclad resolve, believed in one philosophy: equality through adversity, but equality here meant equal pain. His classmates, hardened by their own battles or emboldened by resentment, saw the heir to the throne as nothing more than a symbol to tear down. And they did. From the first week, Charles was singled out, mocked, cornered, targeted. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made was dissected and ridiculed. The bullying wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. Day after day, he was reminded that his lineage meant nothing. In Gordonstown's world, only brute endurance mattered. The toll was swift and devastating. Isolated in freezing dormitories, Charles wrote desperate letters home, pleading to be brought back. He confessed to feeling abandoned, unwanted, even hated. But those letters were not answered the way he hoped. The monarchy needed a hardened heir. His cries were not met with compassion, they were met with silence. Inside, the boy who had once drawn flowers and quoted Shakespeare began to wilt. He stopped speaking unless spoken to. He withdrew, creating an internal world where he could at least control the pain. It was a quiet unraveling, the kind no one could see, but that left permanent scars. Years later, royal biographer Jonathan Dimbleby would describe Gordonstown as cold it's in kilts, a twisted blend of a prisoner, of war camp, and aristocratic schooling. The analogy wasn't far off. For Charles, every day felt like a sentence. The cold was constant, the routine was punishing, and the emotional void stretched endlessly. But in that void, something unexpected began to grow. It wasn't strength in the way his father imagined it. It wasn't resilience born from defiance. It was something quieter, deeper, a slow burning will to survive not just the school, but the destiny he was shackled to. Gordonstown didn't make him fearless. It taught him to hide his fear behind patience. It didn't make him tough. It taught him that endurance was sometimes louder than power. In the absence of love, Charles discovered the first flicker of self-preservation. Yet even in the cold shadow of Gordonstown, a fire was lit. A fire Charles would carry into the next great battle, proving his strength to the world. In the gilded halls of Buckingham, many believed Charles would never make it. They said it behind closed doors. Some said it to his face. Even after Gordonstown had tried to carve steel into the boy's spine, the judgment never stopped. In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, lined with centuries of royal portraits and suffocating expectations, Prince Charles returned not to recognition, but to rejection. Charles drifted like smoke behind heavy doors, from dukes to distant cousins, senior aides to his own blood. The verdict was consistent. He wasn't it. He didn't have the charisma of a king, the iron will of his father, or the divine poise of his mother. They questioned everything about his emotional nature, his intellect, even his voice. They called him too soft, too hesitant, too wrapped in books and feelings to ever command armies or empires. These were not criticisms given in love. They were declarations of doubt, delivered in private parlors and gilded drawing rooms, where legacies were dissected like games on a platter. Charles heard them all. The monarchy never let anything stay truly secret, not even its cruelty. Servants spoke just a little too loudly near doors left ajar. Visiting uncles smirked just long enough after a condescending comment. Even the cousins with no claim to the crown felt entitled to offer thinly veiled jabs, reminding Charles he wasn't the prince the people wanted. It wasn't just mockery, it was an erosion, the kind that wore away self-worth inch by inch, day by day. And still, he never raised his voice. He didn't confront them, not because he agreed, but because he was listening, cataloging, learning, and slowly forging a new weapon out of their words. Queen Elizabeth stood between two fires. As a mother, she knew her son's soul. But as sovereign, she carried the weight of an empire. Her instinct may have been to protect, but the crown demanded impartiality, demanded silence. Her face rarely betrayed what she felt. And in that silence, Charles was left to wonder, did she agree with them? Was her support only ceremonial? Or did she believe deep down that he could be the king this kingdom needed? He would never know for sure, and that uncertainty, more than any insult, carved the deepest wound. But inside that growing void, something else began to stir. Not rage, not vengeance, resolve. Charles didn't plan a rebellion. He didn't seek to shatter the system that belittled him. Instead, he began a quiet transformation. He read more, spoke less, took mental notes of every mistake the royals made, every time tradition failed to evolve. He became fluent in diplomacy, restraint, and silent perseverance. If they thought he was unfit, he would outlast them. If they believed he was weak, he would make resilience his strongest trait. He didn't need their validation. He would earn their silence. To silence the whispers, he needed to act. And nothing silences doubt like putting your life on the line. The boy who once cried in boarding school now soared through the skies, and no one saw it coming. No one expected Prince Charles to join the military. It wasn't just unlikely, It was unthinkable. The same boy who had once penned desperate letters to escape Gordonstown, the prince whose emotional core had long been mistaken for weakness, now stood at the gates of something that could make or break him entirely, the Royal Air Force. For critics within the palace walls, it felt like a performance, another attempt to project an image of strength that simply didn't exist. They scoffed behind his back, calling it symbolic, shallow, a phase that wouldn't last. But Charles wasn't looking for applause. He was looking for something deeper, proof that he was more than what they decided he was. The military, with its ruthless meritocracy and unforgiving standards, would either reveal the truth or expose the lie. He began his training at Cambridge, joining the University Air Squadron, where he flew Chipmunk aircraft, under the critical eyes of instructors who treated him not as a prince, but as a cadet. No special treatment, no ceremonial shortcuts. This time, Charles wasn't the outcast. He was one of many, and every single one of them had to prove their worth in the air. For hours, he studied aerodynamics and navigation, preparing not just for tests, but for the moment the world would finally see him as something more than an ornament of the crown. And then it happened. He earned his RAF wings in 1971. It wasn't handed to him, he earned it. The critics were stunned. The whispers that he would crack under pressure were suddenly drowned out by radio calls from a cockpit that bore his name. Still, the cynicism didn't die overnight. Naval watchers dismissed his efforts as ceremonial. They thought the Navy would break him next. But Charles didn't just pass naval training, he excelled. He commanded ships, executed drills, and proved over and over again that he had what the throne could never give him, credibility built on action, not bloodline. Officers who had once doubted him now saluted him with respect that had nothing to do with royalty. In uniform, he wasn't the sensitive prince or the soft heir. He was a man who had earned his place in one of the world's most demanding institutions. This was no accident. This was evolution. Charles had taken the cruelty of Gordonstown, the scorn of courtiers, and the burden of royal expectation, and turned them into fuel. Every flight, every mission, every order given wasn't just a task. It was a quiet rebellion against the image they had crafted of him. And while the palace continued spinning the narrative of a fragile prince trying to grow into his title, the reality had already shifted. He wasn't growing into it, he was outgrowing them. But his greatest victory wasn't over his enemies, it was over the version of himself they had created. He was born to rule, but raised to doubt. Every crown comes with its own curse. In 1969, the cameras captured a moment meant to symbolize triumph, the investiture of Prince Charles as the Prince of Wales. The pomp, the ancient robes, the golden throne, was everything the monarchy was known for. Yet behind the ceremonial splendor, the man at the center of it all wore a crown far heavier than anyone could see. This wasn't a coronation of confidence. It was a performance draped in tradition, masking the silent fracture within. Charles stood before the nation, not as a celebrated heir, but as a figure still chasing his legitimacy. The cheers outside Caernarfon Castle echoed with praise, but inside he felt the ache of a life constantly measured, questioned, and dissected. That day was meant to cement his destiny. Instead, it deepened the shadow of expectation that followed him into every room, every headline, every breath. His speeches from that era are laced with poetic introspection and a cautious optimism that seemed to be fighting against something darker. He often spoke of identity, duty, and belonging, but between the lines, if one listened closely, were whispers of discomfort, disconnection, and quiet rebellion. He was a man trapped between history and humanity, the eternal heir, always preparing but never arriving, watching time pass him by while the throne remained just out of reach. Every move was scrutinized, every silence was interpreted, and every attempt to be seen beyond the crown was met with resistance from the public, from the press, and at times from his own family. Then came Diana, beautiful, enigmatic, and instantly beloved by the people. She ignited a storm Charles was never truly prepared for. Her light cast an even deeper shadow over him. Suddenly, the prince who had spent his life battling irrelevance became the less admired half of a royal fairy tale. The comparisons were swift and brutal. He was too cold, too old-fashioned, too awkward. She was grace, he was grit. The public adored her innocence and despised his complexity. It wasn't just a marriage under a microscope. It was a battlefield of perception, and Charles was losing. In private, the pressure mounted. He began journaling pages filled with doubts, fears, and painful introspection. They weren't the writings of a bitter man, but of someone desperately trying to understand his place in a machine that had long ago decided his role. Years later, some of those entries would leak, confirming what many suspected. Behind the firm, royal smile was a man unraveling quietly, a man who no longer knew where the crown ended and he began. The monarchy demanded devotion, but gave no room for self. It offered grandeur, but at the cost of peace. And Charles, for all his titles and training, still hadn't found the approval he had been chasing since boyhood. But the world only saw the exterior until age forced him to confront what time had buried deep. At 75, the mask cracked, and what emerged was not weakness, but a man who had lived in chains. For decades, Prince then King Charles had worn the same mask passed down through generations, composed, reserved, impenetrable, but time has a way of forcing truth to the surface. And when the world least expected it, he let it all out. Not in a scandal, not through leaks or gossip, but with words deliberately chosen in a quiet, televised conversation. He spoke not of governance or pageantry, but of something far more unsettling: regret. He didn't say it outright, but it hung in every pause, every softened tone, every careful nod to the years behind him. He spoke of a life spent misunderstood, a life defined not by decisions he made, but by roles he was assigned. The audience expected a monarch. What they got was a man finally unburdening himself. Behind the scenes, the walls of the palace that once confined his emotions became the setting for overdue conversations. With Prince William, there was a long-awaited exchange of son to father, heir to king. Not about succession, but about wounds passed down through silence. Charles, for the first time, admitted what had long been felt, but never said that he had spent his life performing a version of himself he barely recognized. With Princess Anne, the bond was different, raw, honest, unfiltered. She had always been the unflinching one. But even she, the rock of the royal family, was moved by his confession. They talked not like royals, but like survivors of the same unyielding machine, acknowledging that the rules they lived by had stolen more than they'd ever been allowed to grieve. Then came the moment that truly shattered precedent. Charles Stoic, refined Charles, spoke publicly about therapy, about his own mental health, about the impact of generations of emotional suppression. No monarch before him had dared to do so. It wasn't a weakness, it was a declaration. A statement that strength is not silence, that leadership does not require numbness. In that moment, he dismantled the royal illusion brick by brick, not to destroy it, but to let light in. The very vulnerability he had been punished for as a child was now his weapon. The boy mocked for being too sensitive had grown into a king who ruled by connection, but intimidation. The reaction was seismic. The public, conditioned to view royalty as symbols rather than souls, stood stunned. Headlines didn't scream scandal, they whispered admiration. Some cried, others wrote letters. Many simply watched, silent, unsure how to process the image of a monarch showing pain. but the impact was undeniable. For the first time, the people saw Charles not as a man failing to live up to his crown, but as someone who had finally redefined what that crown could mean. And as the world leaned in to hear more, Charles dropped the final truth, one that shattered centuries of royal silence. We thought we knew the monarchy, we were wrong, and Charles finally confirmed it. For centuries, the British monarchy operated like an impenetrable fortress, one built not just of tradition, but of illusion. Every smile, every public appearance, every carefully choreographed gesture served a single purpose: to maintain the myth. The royals didn't cry, they didn't struggle, they didn't falter, at least not where the public could see. The emotional machinery was buried deep, locked behind the iron gates of palace protocol. But Charles, born into this system, broken by it, and now leading it, finally admitted the truth the institution worked so hard to deny. The image was never real. The monarchy, in its most sacred form, had been built on silence, and Charles's confession cracked its foundation wide open. Behind closed doors, he had fought for years to modernize the royal brand. He knew that the world was changing and that blind deference was giving way to authenticity. But every attempt at reform was met with resistance. Palisades, loyal to the old guard, pushed back. The firm, the secretive network of courtiers and power brokers who managed the monarchy's every move, viewed Charles's ideas as dangerous. He wanted transparency, they demanded tradition. He wanted humanity, they insisted on myth. And so, the man who would be king found himself in a quiet civil war, not with the people, but with the very system he was born to serve. There were battles the public never saw, arguments over press access, decisions about who could speak and how much could be revealed. Even Charles's openness about environmentalism and architecture were once considered reckless. If he deviated from the script, he was labeled unstable. If he stayed silent, he was called out of touch. For decades, he walked that tightrope knowing that stepping too far in either direction could cost him everything. And so, he waited. Patiently, strategically, until the right moment came. That moment arrived when time itself turned against him. As whispers of declining health crept into public consciousness, Charles realized what every monarch eventually must. But he is not guaranteed. He could no longer afford to be the version of himself others had written. He had to reclaim the narrative, not as the heir apparent, not as the cautious king, but as a man who had seen the rot from within and decided to speak anyway. His confession wasn't just personal, it was political, a rebellion against the cold machinery that had raised him to be quiet, obedient, and hollow. And in doing so, he shattered the very illusion that once protected the crown, the monarchy didn't break him. He exposed its fragility. By revealing that even a king could feel caged, he made the public question everything they had been told about royal strength. For Charles, the truth was never the threat. The real danger was what happened when no one dared to speak it. And so, in his final act of defiance, he did what no king before him had the courage to do. He showed the world the man behind the curtain, and as the veil lifts, one final revelation remains the cost he paid to keep everyone else comfortable. At the end of a crown's wait is one question: was it worth it? Charles is finally ready to answer. As the weight of 75 years settled across his shoulders, heavier than any ceremonial robe, more piercing than any crown, Charles finally allowed himself to ask what had once been unthinkable. Did it all mean anything? Not in the ceremonial sense, not in the history books, but deep within the quiet places where a man stores his grief, his pride, his unmet longings. He looked back, not as a king, but as a father, a son, a human being who had spent his life watching from behind palace walls, while the world interpreted him through headlines and tradition. He reflected on the childhood he never got to live, those rare, fleeting moments of freedom, smothered by the relentless march of preparation. Duty had shaped him, but it had also stolen from him, and for the first time he said it aloud. There were conversations the public never heard, private words shared with Camilla, not about protocol or scandal, but about love that survived despite every pressure meant to crush it. With William, the dialogue shifted. No longer just heir to heir, but man to man. They talked about mistakes, about the things neither could fix, and about what must never be repeated. And then, of course, there was Harry, the most fractured bond of all. While the media speculated endlessly, the truth unfolded in hushed voices, regret, mixed with resilience, heartbreak, stitched with hope. Charles never claimed to have been the perfect father, but in those final exchanges, he gave his sons something he never received from his own: an apology wrapped in honesty, an embrace of imperfection. His eyes turned to the monarchy itself, an institution he had served, challenged, and ultimately reshaped. When closed doors, he'd laid out a new blueprint for the future. Fewer titles, more transparency, compassion as strength. Not because he wanted to dismantle the crown, but because he wanted it to mean something more than survival. He understood now that the crown could not demand silence from those it claimed to protect. His vision was radical, not in structure, but in spirit. A monarchy where authenticity wasn't punished, where humanity didn't need to be hidden, where the next generation wouldn't carry the same ghosts. And still, even with all the admissions, there remained the public's misunderstanding of this enduring belief that Charles had been weak, passive, ill-fitted for greatness. But what they hadn't seen, what they had refused to understand, was that his power had always been quiet, subtle, enduring. He wasn't the lion that roared. He was the stone that never cracked. And every decision, there had been sacrifice. Behind every silence, a scream swallowed for the sake of tradition. And now, with the weight of age upon him, and the burden of truth finally lifted, Charles could acknowledge the price he had paid, his health chipped away by stress, his family fragmented by silence, his identity shaped by roles he never chose. King Charles may have waited 75 years to tell us the truth, but now that he has, the monarchy may never be the same again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the